Okay, well, what do we need to think about when we are adapting old buildings? That is the sort of key question in my mind. And I'm going to start just quickly looking through a few examples of that. This is an old mill up in the Scottish borders, and the shell of the mill was thoroughly repaired, very carefully repaired, using all the appropriate materials, lime mortars and so on. And then a new insertion was dropped into it to create holiday accommodation. And that doesn't touch that stone building, the original building, and it has been carefully done so all the windows line up with the apertures that were in that original stone building. So it's a very sensitive sort of approach. This is maybe a much bolder approach. This is in London's Covent Garden, and it's a walkway created between the Royal Ballet School and the Royal Opera House. It's called the Bridge of Aspiration because of the youngsters crossing that bridge into the world of sort of real theatre and ballet. And then a Georgian terrace that has been reimagined with an extension at the end of it. Very simple, very clean, clearly of the 21st century, but at the same time has some sort of sympathy with the older buildings. But these sort of things don't have to be, big projects. It can be something to do with just lighting. Lighting old buildings is not easy, and adapting them so they work in a modern way is not always easy. But something as simple as a new handrail put in with LED lights fitted into the handrail, very simple, very clean, but look what it does for the brickwork and how it emphasizes the historic nature of the building. What all these projects have in common is that they fit. The new is fitted to the old rather than the old being fitted to the new. That is the key to doing work with old buildings. The last thing you want to do is mess up the old to make the new work. The other thing that all those projects have in common is that they are good design of today, of the 21st century. They're not trying to replicate the past. They're not trying to be a pastiche of the past, which you so often see. That really doesn't work. We want to leave something for each of our ages, and that is why those buildings succeed. I think this is a lovely example of how a building has grown over time. All those accretions that have been added, you can quite clearly see the growth of that building and the way it's happened and the beauty of the materials. But that is what adds beauty to it, because it has grown in that way over time. A lot of us walk down streets and we think this is a nice place to live, but we don't always know why. We don't actually look up necessarily to understand why it's a nice place to walk down or to live in or whatever. But it's to do with craftsmanship. It's to do with detail. It's to do with texture. It's to do with light and shade. It's to do with the patina of age. And you can see that in this little cutout here, which is from one of the details of one of the windows high up there. It's got all those attributes, the craftsmanship, the detail, the texture, and they give it the light and shade. And then you've got the patina of age as well coming in there. When we think about adapting old buildings, we need to understand them. It's really important to actually understand what you're dealing with. So you need to understand the form, the function, the materials, the history of the building, and the way the building has developed, because as you've seen in those earlier slides, buildings develop over time, and they change with the people that live in them and use those buildings. So we've got here a perfect example of that. A building that needed a staircase. You've got that lovely old wall with that patina of age. And in front of it, a modern addition, a concrete staircase leading up past that wall. And the two work in great harmony with each other. This is an interesting example where you've got a cottage that was bought with planning permission to put a loft conversion in and to extend it into the roof. The new owner met with the conservation professional on site, the conservation officer on site, and the conservation officer actually said, "Why are you trying to do this in an old building and damage the old building? Why don't you build something new next to the old building?" And this is how this came about. Quite a revolutionary sort of looking building, and quite a big building compared with that little cottage. It's called the Gasworks, and it takes that name from what was on the site before. There was a gasworks with this cylinder on the site. And by taking that history, it added something to the new building. You've got this cylinder that represents the old gas cylinder. And you've got quite a sort of industrial feel against the old cottage. That is Corten steel, that new addition. Something much simpler, but nonetheless something that really works. A little cottage in West Sussex with a very simple addition added to the end, with vertical timber planking and a clay tile roof. And when you look from the end of that extension, you can see the rhythm down that building and how beautifully it works. But you can also clearly see that that is a new extension. The thing I'm not sure about with that cottage is the way you get from one bit to the other. They've put a glass slot in there. Glass slots are quite loved by planners because they define where the new and the old meet. I'm not totally convinced. The problem with glass slots is that they look quite good on an architect's drawing, but when you actually get them in real life, you get reflections. The nature of the glass isn't as clear-cut as on a drawing. And you also get light pollution coming out at night. And you're very visible as an occupant of that building or a user of that building going through the glass slot. And there is also that great sort of feeling when you bridge the two. You're aware of it every time. Maybe something that works a little better is this. This is the Ditchling Museum. They have used essentially a shadow gap between the two buildings. And it sort of disappears into the background, so you really don't see it. But at the same time, you can distinctly see that you've got two buildings there of different periods. So what do we need to think about when we are working with old buildings? Well, we need to remember that they're very different, whether they're a timber frame medieval house, a Georgian townhouse, or a Victorian or Edwardian building. They are different. They've got solid walls, or usually have solid walls. Normally, those walls are built with lime mortars, lime renders, lime plasters, and they're also breathable. And that's a key thing we need to think about. What do I mean by breathable? Well, when it rains, the moisture goes into the fabric of the building. And when the sun comes out and the wind blows, that moisture is sucked out again. The same thing is happening on the inside of the building. You get the moisture from cooking, from washing, from people breathing inside the building. That goes into the fabric of the building to a degree. But they also had drafty buildings, open fires, and that moisture was pulled out again. So when we're building new extensions and doing work to old buildings, adapting old buildings, we need to think about this and ensuring that those processes can work in modern applications. There's also the heat flow going through the walls, which we need to think about, and that will, of course, continue today. But the big problem is we're all very keen on modern materials. We see them as quick fixes. We tend to use cement mortars, cement renders, and we put those on old buildings. And you can see there, you've got brickwork that's been repointed in cement. You've got a cement render that has been put on the outside of that building. And then the frost gets in, can't escape because of those hard materials, and the whole thing blows apart, and you damage the old building. The same thing happens with paint up in the right-hand corner there. The paint has trapped the moisture and the paint has fallen off the wall. And then you start getting rot and you get beetle infestations. You don't get those things if you keep the building dry and breathable. You don't get woodworm. You don't need to put chemical treatments in there because you simply don't get it. So what do we need to think about when we are going to work and adapt with an old building? Well, you need to be compatible. You need to be structurally sound in your ideas and what you're going to do. And you need to be visually successful in these solutions you're looking for. And also, as Ian mentioned, sustainability is another big part of this. You need to think sustainably and how you're going to create sustainable solutions, because you've got something in the first place that is inherently sustainable in having an old building. I think this is a lovely example of what you can do. That was a ruin. It was an old dovecot that was totally ruined up in the Snape Maltings. And they decided, rather than try and repair or sort of rebuild that dovecot, they would insert a new building within it. That's Corten steel again, and it was literally dropped in. The old building was repaired very carefully to keep as much as possible, but then that new building was dropped inside to create a studio for artists. This is another extension to an old building on the left there. And look how that sort of merges into the background as a shadow. It's like the shadow gap again. That is burnt timber that has been used, burnt cedar that has been used for the vertical cladding. And also big panes of glass, which act as mirrors very effectively. So when you look at it from a distance, it just merges into the landscape. So they've been able to extend that building by quite a large extent, but at the same time create something that really does not spoil the view. And you can have some quite big, bold extensions added to buildings. This is the National Theatre in London. And it's not quiet in that sort of sense. It's certainly very prominent, but the thing about it is it's mannerly. It's not a rude sort of building. It really does work alongside the National Theatre. And that is something we need to think about, and it's been thought about here with this old warehouse where they have added an extension. Again, it's very bold. It's clad in bronze, and you've got those quite dramatic angles. But look how well those two buildings work together, and the way they've been separated in the middle. They've got that gap again between the two, so you know which is old and which is new. A big question that a lot of buildings have when you start trying to adapt them is that you've got a big volume of space. Churches, barns, all those sort of buildings have this big volume of space in the middle. And you don't want to lose that volume, because you start losing the wonderful roof and feel of the building. So you can put pods in there to create the spaces that you need. Here you've got a living space, you've got a fireplace pod, and you've got the kitchen pod. And that is a really good way of converting those buildings so they can be used again. And this is Magdalen College in Oxford. And again, they have put a pod in that building, in the library. And it stands away from the walls of the building, so the windows are still usable and readable as they were. And the wonderful thing about this is that when you go up to the top, you're right up in the roof. You can actually see all that fine roof detail that people never saw in the past at all. And this is All Souls Bolton, where again pods have been dropped in there to create a cafe, office space and other spaces within the building, but still maintaining the volume of the building and that fantastic roof there. Getting light into buildings is hugely important when you start adapting them. This is another Georgian building, and they wanted to put an extension on. It had an outbuilding, but no link between the outbuilding and the house itself. So they added a corridor between the two, so that you kept that light well between the two that let in the air, let in the light, and let in the rain, and meant you were in touch with the environment outside. And then looking at it from the back, you can see that corridor on the left, the light well in the middle there, and then the original building beyond. And the Natural History Museum in Oxford. This is a slightly more unusual example of adaptation. When it was originally built, they put in huge gas lights And they turned them on for the opening of the building, and there was a terrible smoke in the building, and I don't think those gas lights were ever turned on again. But the problem was that they could never use the building for corporate events in the evening or anything that happened in the evening because the building was dark. So they came up with this scheme using LED lights, which is fairly obvious. The second bit of that scheme is not so obvious because they decided to use magnets to stick the LED lights to the cast iron structure of the building, and also to stick all the cables that were needed for those lights to the structure of the building, which meant the whole thing was reversible, and you can take those out without causing any damage to the building at all. And lastly, not a very nice slide, but maybe for a reason really, that maintenance is something that is so often forgotten with buildings, and that's why we end up with so many buildings in a poor state. But also, when we add to an old building, you've got to think about maintenance, not just to the new building, but how you maintain the old one. And these poor people have had this conservatory built. How do they now clean their dormer window? How do they repair the dormer window? How do they repair the thatch? You've got to have scaffolding to get up there and do any of that work that you should be doing at least once a year. So a lot to think about. All these themes are expanded upon in the book that I've written with Ian Boyd. And that book is available at the Reba Bookshop at the show and also obviously online. And I think it is really worth going away and thinking, if you are planning to adapt an old building, how you're going to do it, and think very carefully before you start.